Good morning. My name is Jared. I have the honor and privilege of serving as the executive director over the Sacred Grace. It's a joy to be with you this morning. Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? These haunting words, first uttered in Aramaic, which is the everyday language of Jesus, are recorded by both Matthew and Mark in the Gospels. And they're words that speak to the agony of spiritual pain, the pain of feeling abandoned by God. In the series in the season of Lent, we're addressing the promise of pain. The wisdom from both Nathan and Maggie over the last several weeks has been, how do we look deeper into and learn from the pain that we experience in the different domains of life? And it requires both humility and honesty to hear the wisdom of Jesus. In this world, you will have trouble. Or in this world, you will have pain. But he says, I have overcome the world. And I believe he is here to say, I have overcome your pain. And so this morning, I'm going to share my reflections on spiritual pain. And what are we to do when we feel abandoned by God? The text is Psalm 22, verse 1 to 18. You can read along on the screen, or if you have a Bible, turn to it. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish? My God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer, by night, but I find no rest. Yet you are enthroned as the Holy One. You are the one Israel praises. In you our ancestors put their trust. They trusted and you delivered them. To you they cried out and were saved, and in you they trusted and were not put to shame. But I am a worm and not a man, scorned by everyone, despised by all the people. All who see me mock me. They hurl insults, shaking their head. He trusts in the Lord, they say. Let the Lord rescue him. Let him deliver him, since he delights in him. Yet you brought me out of the womb. You made me trust you, even at my mother's breast. From birth I was cast on you. From my mother's womb you have been my God. Do not be far from me, for trouble is near and there is no one to help. Many bulls surround me, the strong bulls of Bashan encircle me. Roaring lions that tear their prey open their mouths wide against me. I am poured out like water, and my bones are all out of joint. My heart has turned to wax. It is melted within me. My mouth is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. You lay me in the dust of death. Dogs surround me, and a pack of villains encircles me, and they pierce my hands and my feet. All my bones are on display. People stare and gloat over me, and they divide my clothes among them and cast lots for my garment. The words of Psalm 22 foreshadow the crucifixion. You hear in it the insults that are hurled, the pierced hands and feet, and the divided clothes of Jesus. They're words that are cried out from the cross in the agony of spiritual pain. Spiritual pain is that mental, emotional, and relational pain that's uniquely correlated to our spirituality, including the sense and experience that our trust in God can no longer be trusted. I believe that we have all experienced pain and suffering, that sense of abandonment, the deafening silence at moments in our relationship with God in some way. Because the path of spiritual pain is a path that every person of faith will walk at some point in their journey with God. It's important as we begin this morning to acknowledge that although our hope is at the church to be a place for people to walk through and heal from spiritual pain, we have tragically been the source of spiritual pain for many. Pain and spiritual abuse coming from wounds that people have experienced being a part of a faith community. And so this morning I want to talk for just a moment about spiritual abuse and spiritual wounds that we may have experienced inside the church. Spiritual abuse is defined as the psychological and emotional manipulation characterized by a systemic pattern of using coercive and controlling behavior in a religious context. To be clear, it is the misuse and abuse of power that's connected to some sort of spiritual authority. And that spiritual abuse can have deeply damaging impacts that are not only spiritual, but are mental and emotional and physical as well. And those who have suffered from it have a wound that is very difficult to heal from. And stories have become tragically common about the misuse and the abuse of power from leaders within faith communities. Now, spiritual wounds is a term that I think is important for us to hold as well. I would describe these as the wounds that we have from living a life of faith in the context simply of a community of broken people. That the care that we needed that we did not receive, or the counsel that was given to us was ill-timed or insensitive, or that the leadership that we were following was simply immature. In short, our spiritual wounds are all the ways in which we do not fully follow the way of Jesus, the leading of the Spirit and the love of the Father, and the painful and negative impact that we have on ourselves and each other. And I think it's important to differentiate the difference between spiritual abuse and spiritual wounds, because spiritual abuse is systemic and it's intentional and it's coercive and it was controlling. It, like other forms of abuse, is the misuse of power that was intended to cause harm. We all have wounds, similar to our childhood, the brokenness and the humanity of the adults that raised us. We experienced childhood wounds, but thankfully we did not all experience some sort of abuse as children. And similarly, we all have spiritual wounds, but we have not all suffered or experienced spiritual abuse. My story holds both. My father was a Baptist minister. We were never at the church, or never at the same church longer than 4 years, because we were consistently being moved on. Twice while we were on vacation, my father received a phone call to not come back to work. It was incredibly disorienting for my family, and we felt betrayed and we felt wounded by the church. It was not until much later in my adult life that I realized that my father was not without fault in the situation, but still there was a complete misuse of power. And the impact on me and my family was a suspicion of churches and their leadership and the power that surrounded that. But beyond the carelessness and the misuse of power that I witnessed in church as a child, a much more poignant pain of spiritual abuse came through a person in a position of trust. In one of the churches my father served on staff, the children's pastor sexually abused several boys in the church, and I was one of them. And my story is not the ongoing trauma that too many have experienced, but it did impact my sense of safety within the church and the people in leadership in the church. And I want to be clear at this point that my experience of spiritual woundedness and spiritual abuse were mixed in with some of the most meaningful and caring and compassionate leaders and churches that I've ever known. Both can be true. Church, like life, is not a zero-sum game. You and I both know that painful experiences in the church are not isolated to childhood. I have experienced wounds from church leaders who have failed to live up to their own ideals, and pastors who have kept their personal lives hidden in the shadows. And as a leader in the church for almost 30 years, I have been the one who has been trusted to lead and to represent God's love and the way of Jesus, and I have failed. My choices as a person in a position of power have wounded people. My fear and my anxiety, my self-preservation and self-protection have often left people that I love and respect with unresolved questions about the church and even about God. Some I have known how I've wounded them, but there are many I imagine that I do not fully know how I have been a source of their spiritual woundedness or their spiritual pain. The leaders of the church, of which I am one, have not led as we should. And as one pastor and leader of the church, I want to say I am sorry. We pray often the world is not as it should be. And this morning I want you to hear the church is not as it should be. And if you have experienced abuse or woundedness from the church, I am sorry for the wrong done to you. And I pray that you would come to forgive those wrongs that were done to you for the healing of your own heart and your mind and your soul. I would encourage you to talk with someone that you trust about your story. That shame and blame both grow in the shadows and in secrecy. And if you don't have someone that you can talk to, Maggie or Nathan, the elders or myself would be honored to hear and to hold your story. So I want to return to the focus of this reflection. What do we do with the mental, emotional, and relational pain that's uniquely correlated to our spirituality and our trust in God? What do we do when we feel abandoned by God? Because there are countless ways beyond the church that our connection with God is disrupted. If you take a cursory overview of our scriptures, it's clear that to have a life of faith is to be promised pain. The stories in scriptures and the lives of the saints show us that pain is inevitable, that spiritual pain is part of the process. One of the clearest examples in my lifetime is the story of Mother Teresa, whose journals were published after her death. And in them, for years, there is a deafening silence from God that is incredibly painful for her. The term that's often given to this sense of suffering or a season of suffering in faith is the dark night of the soul. And it's this disorienting reality of feeling abandoned by God. And we are not alone in that experience. Jesus, the very Son of God, suffers spiritual pain. So let's return to the words of Jesus. At 3 p.m, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? These haunting words are recorded in both Mark 15 and Matthew 27, and I believe that they are words that speak to the agony of spiritual pain, the experience of feeling abandoned by God. And I believe the words of Jesus are actually an invitation for us and how we respond to spiritual pain. The words of Jesus invite us to do two things. First, to recall the scriptures, and second, to cry to God. The words of Jesus from the cross come from a text. They are borrowed words. They are words written and recalled for generations before they are spoken by Jesus. They are the opening lines of Psalm 22, which continues for 18 stanzas of the feelings of suffering and of pain and of abandonment. And Jesus, in his last breath and among his last words, is recalling the scriptures. He's recalling the Psalms, a songbook of suffering. There are more psalms of lament than any other form in the book of Psalms. And the Psalms have given language to the people of God in spiritual pain for centuries. Now, our cultural dilemma, I believe, is that we swerve from one ditch to the other about spiritual pain. Either we pretend that it doesn't hurt, that there's no pain. In an attempt, we sort of posture some sort of false piety. And this is opposite to what the scriptures and saints have shown us, and I believe it is counter to the way of Jesus. The other ditch that we swerve to is that we demand that God exists on our terms. We have somehow constructed a spirituality of a life without pain or suffering or sorrow. We're not happy with God. We want better customer service from him. And we've come to live in this illusion in this moment where we think the customer's always right. This is completely contrary to the way of Jesus. And the Psalms guide us in another way. Tish Harrison Warren, in her book Prayer in the Night, writes this: the Psalms form us into a people who can hold the depths of our sorrow with utter honesty, even as we hold to the promises of God. The Psalms form us into a people who can hold the depths of our sorrow with utter honesty, even as we hold to the promises of God. Both can be true. More than any other scripture, Jesus quotes the Psalms. His words from the cross, I believe, are an invitation into the long tradition of borrowed words that become our own to express the disillusion, the despair, and the disorienting moments where we feel and experience spiritual pain. So what are we to do with spiritual pain? I think we are to borrow words. 2 ways to borrow words is to pray the Psalms or read good books. This is Tish's book, Prayer in the Night. And she talks about her own journey of sorrow and of spiritual pain. Countless saints have walked through spiritual pain and the dark night of the soul. You are not alone in the experience. Do not allow yourself to be alone. Read the scriptures and read the saints. So the words of Jesus come from a text, but they also come with a tone. There's an audible description of the word that he cried in a loud voice. The Greek word here is an onomatopoeia, which is the closest thing I got to humor in this whole talk, was the use of the word onomatopoeia, because it's a word that sounds like it feels. Because the term that's used in Greek is a visceral sound of an intense emotion. The word is bow. Bow. To make an urgent distress call that's sorely needing a response. And bow sounds exactly what it is. It's an animal caught in a trap. It's a sheep that's bleeding. It's a dog that's yelping. An incredible amount of pain, sorely needing a response and a rescue. And it's this word that's used in the Gospel of Luke where the blind man cries out to Jesus, "Have mercy on me." It's an audible expression of anguish. It's a cry. It's not a polite tear in the corner of your eye, but it's untamed and unedited and uncivilized signal of distress. And so what are we to do with spiritual pain? I think the words of Jesus teach us to cry. To cry to God in desperation and in agony and demanding a response. And it's this interaction that's actually the deepest juxtaposition of our faith. We are crying out to God, the one that we feel abandoned by. And this is the way of Jesus. Jürgen Moltmann writes in The Crucified God, "Our faith begins at the point where atheists suppose that it must be at an end. At the point of spiritual pain and anguish and agony is the juxtaposition and the intersection of where our faith becomes real." Jürgen Moltmann was born in Germany in 1926. He was drafted into the German army against his will at the age of 16 in 1943. And in his first battle, he surrendered to the first British soldier he met in 1945. He would spend 3 years being moved around Europe as a prisoner of war in camps. And he would consistently be exposed over the next 3 years to the images of the horror that his country was inflicting on the Jewish people. He writes that his remorse was so great for what his country had done that he stated that he would have often rather died than to have had to face what his nation had done. And these horrific experiences shape his view of suffering. But it is in those camps that he is introduced to a Christian and introduced to a suffering God. And it shapes his view of suffering, and it shapes his view of hope. And his writing about spiritual pain is that in some small way, we join in the suffering of God. Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. These are visceral and emotional words. They're the words of Jesus that have been recited for centuries by those who have suffered. And they are an invitation for us to follow in the way of Jesus. What do we do with spiritual pain? We recall and recite the scriptures, and we cry to God. Would you pray with me? Father, the world is not as it should be. The church is not as it should be. We suffer and we experience pain. And we somehow hold with humility that although we are promised pain, the deeper promise is that we are not alone in our pain. We are with Jesus. We are crying to the Father, have mercy. We trust that you hear. We trust that you are near. We trust that you love. Amen.